One of the least talked about reasons why the psoas becomes chronically tight is related to one of its functions. So what should you do if you have chronically tight hip flexors? Hi, I'm Dr. Ryan. I'm the founder of Core Balance Training, and today we're going to be talking about the psoas muscle and why it gets chronically tight and how it can be contributing to stenosis in most people with chronic lower back pain, whether you should be strengthening it if it's weak or stretching it if it's tight, why you probably shouldn't be getting it released, and finally, what is the best thing to be doing for your chronically tight psoas muscle? But first, we want to answer the question of why it's chronically tight and how it's contributing to your back pain, or what most people suffering with chronic lower back pain have, which is stenosis. While the psoas is a hip flexor, we're going to look at how it contributes to anterior pelvic tilt and how when it's chronically tight, it can actually hold us in this position of anterior pelvic tilt by contracting and pulling that lumbar spine into lordosis. You can see the pelvis can be rotated forward. And this is how we're going to link the psoas to a cause of stenosis. So you can see when the pelvis rotates into that anterior position, it actually closes down the spaces between the vertebrae. It compresses the back of the disc, makes those spaces smaller for the nerves and blood vessels to exit out of. They have less space to exit. And this increases the chances of the nerves getting compressed as they exit the spine. And this is how we define stenosis. It's the closing of the canals, either the lateral or the central foramen, where blood vessels and nerves flow through. So now that we've made the connection between the psoas and stenosis through the postural condition of anterior pelvic tilt, let's talk about why the psoas gets chronically tight. So there's different reasons, from sitting too much, which puts the hip flexors into a shortened position. And then when you go to stand up, they're still in that shortened position and they can pull on that lumbar spine, as we showed. But there's other reasons why the psoas gets tight as well. One of which is a protective mechanism. The psoas is a fight or flight muscle. It's considered the walking muscle. It pulls your leg forward to walk or run. And so if you are under chronic stress, you're going into a sympathetic state. That is the fight or flight response. And this muscle can activate and become chronically tight as a protective response. And finally, I think one of the least talked about reasons why the psoas becomes chronically tight is related to one of its functions. And so we're going to look at a function that is not well understood. So if we look at the anatomy of the psoas, we can see that it's intimately tied to the lumbar spine. It connects all of the vertebrae together, and it is very much in line with the lumbar spine. And so if we understand that the only action that muscles know how to do is contract, that's the only thing they can do is contract and shorten their fibers, that the action of contracting the psoas may not only be for hip flexion, which happens if the leg is not fixed to the ground. But what if the leg is fixed to the ground? We're still going to get the same forces within the fibers of the muscle. They're going to be shortening and contracting. But now that the leg is fixed to the ground, it's not lifting up. We're just going to get compression on the lumbar spine. And this is one of the major functions of the psoas muscle. And it's widely agreed upon. It is a lumbar spine compressor. Axial compression is one of the functions of the spine. And the reason that it probably does this is to generate stability for a spine that is unstable or needs stability. These muscles cuff the lumbar spine, surrounding it with the ability to contract and compress and stabilize the lumbar spine, turning it into one solid unit. It is a highly effective stabilizer of this part of our body. And this is going to tie into why the psoas muscle often becomes chronically tight. The body is searching for stability. And earlier I said you may not want to be releasing your psoas muscle. And that's because the body is tightening it for a reason. It feels like it needs stability. It wants stability. And if you're releasing that muscle, you're just undoing what the body is trying to do. And I have a personal story that explains exactly what I'm talking about, because I suffered from chronic lower back pain for over a decade. And I did everything I could do to loosen up my tight hip flexors. And one time I went to the extreme of getting dry needling into my hip flexors, and they stuck a long needle into this muscle through my back, past my vertebrae, and they released this muscle with trigger point dry needling. It was very effective for releasing the muscle. And I got up off the table and went through the rest of my day, and I had this incredible feeling of looseness and instability in my spine. It felt like my upper half of my body was disconnected from the lower half of my body. And it was not a good feeling. I felt like I needed that stability, and I ended up just laying down for the rest of the day because I just didn't feel like it was good for my body to keep walking around. There were things jolting around and moving around, and I felt like there was a lot of friction and instability going on in there. So what should you do if you have chronically tight hip flexors? The approach that we've been taking is to provide the lumbar spine with more stability from the other muscles around it. If we can get the abdominal muscles, not just the six-pack abs, but all the layers of the abdominal muscles to have more tone in them, and then we can generate stability through our breath, through breathing into our intra-abdominal pressure. It's Mary Masterson's Coke can analogy. We have the ability to generate an incredible amount of stability for our spine. It is the most effective way to stabilize your spine. If you've ever heard of an anti-gravity treadmill, it uses the exact same physics to create the ability for humans to walk or run on a very low percentage of their body weight, as low as 10% of their body weight, because they're using pressure inside the treadmill to combat the forces of gravity. So we can do that with our abdomen. It's called intra-abdominal pressure, and I'm not going to get too deep into it in this video because this is about the psoas muscle, but I do talk about it a lot in other videos, and I just want to say that if we can provide more support for our lumbar spine with our abdominal core and our intra-abdominal pressure, the psoas muscle will feel safe to let go and release some of its tightness that it is doing just to try and generate stability. And so that's the main takeaway that I would want you to have from this video is maybe it's not so much about stretching my psoas or whether it's too strong or too weak, but that it's just trying to protect your lumbar spine. And if you can help support that lumbar spine, the psoas can release itself and function as the normal muscle that it should be, which is flexing the hip, walking, and doing other things rather than just being chronically tight and kind of being locked in that position. We've had lots of success with muscles releasing on their own without having to manually release them or stretch them until the cows come home, knowing that they're just going to tighten right back up, simply by giving the muscles more support. So hopefully you find that helpful, and I'll see you next week.